Thanks for the opportunity to be here and to make this presentation. This is really important work. We're going to move quickly. We're going to try to cover a lot of material at a pretty high level. We could spend 8 hours on this topic easily, just for the city of Delray Beach. So anyway, this is an introduction. I want to start by just giving you a little bit of background on IRC. We are based in Delray Beach, and we work on uniting global thinking with local expertise. So we're trying to take the guidance that's coming out at the global level and apply it to the local problem. We're also trying to get local knowledge and local experience to scale up to the global scale. We produce all kinds of resources. So we want to provide guidance for people so that people can do things in a positive way across a whole bunch of different realms, from websites to pamphlets to books to presentations like this one and so forth. So we have an ecological restoration practice. So we do restoration. We're not just talking about it, we're doing it. And an important part of this program is that we engage with the public, with the community, with the local stakeholders, because in our view, if you don't do that, if you're just doing restoration without engaging the public, then you're doomed to long-term failure. So we have to build support, and that's a really important part of what we do, and especially important in places like Delray. We also work at the global policy level, so we help to produce the international principles and standards for the practice of ecological restoration. This is a very important document globally. It underpins the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It's been downloaded more than 60,000 times since it was published a little over 3 years ago. And it's already been cited more than 900 times in scientific literature. So why is this work important? So we have a multiple series of crises that are affecting the planet, from the extinction crisis to climate change and sea level rise, and then other issues like diseases and invasive species. So, literally society is at risk, and we're at risk of losing incredible amounts of biodiversity, but also hurting ourselves in the process. So in response to these crises, and also the crisis of land degradation globally, conversion of productive landscapes into dry lands and deserts, for example, the UN declared 2021 to 2030 as the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And I like this quote from UNEP: "There has never been a more urgent need to restore damaged ecosystems than now." The point I want to make about all this, people think, oh, what do we do? It's a global problem, it's overwhelming, I can't deal. But the reality is that we know that every little incremental thing that people do matters. So what happens in Delray Beach matters. People might say, oh, well, we just have this little patch of native vegetation, or we have this little park or whatever, and it can't matter in the overall scheme of the universe. But that, in fact, is quite wrong. Every little bit that we can do to move things in the right direction toward restoration is important. And so we want to provide people with ideas and tools so that they can make a difference. And I like this quote. We collaborate with a whole bunch of different municipalities and government agencies and so forth all over South Florida. This one's from the town of Palm Beach and the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach. Understanding the past creates a sense of belonging in the present and guides our path to a better future. So what does the past in Delray look like? Hi. Hello. Come on in. So one of the things that's really important when we talk about restoration in a broad sense is that people were here before us, right? And those people had a very positive interaction with the environment, all right? And so an important thing that we need to remember is that they were here. The Glades Indians went extinct by the late 1700s, and then the Miccosukee and the Seminole permanently settled in the early 1800s. But there was this period where things like fire, indigenous burning, which were really important for coastal dunes and scrub and pine flatwoods and so forth, where that indigenous burning would have stopped, right? So there was a period of this degradation process. But it's important to think about what changed when indigenous people were no longer an important or a major component of the landscape. All right, so we're going to look at some of the ecosystems in Delray real quick. So the beach dune, we're going to start in the east, and we're going to move our way to the west. So we have the Pioneer Zone, and so on the left we have in Palm Beach, you can see that's a little bit degraded. The beach dune is there's a little cliff there where the pioneer zone needs to be restored. But Delray has a very, very healthy pioneer zone or beach dune system. What people understand less about is the coastal strand ecosystem, and this is where most of the biodiversity on the barrier islands was. So you're talking about dozens and dozens, including endemic species, lived in this ecosystem. And I think the Delray example is interesting, but for those of you who drive down to Boca, this is Palmetto Park Road and A1A. It's now a forest, but you can see that the coastal strand was this open, flat, very sunny ecosystem, and for the most part, it's all been converted to trees and forests, sea grape forests in particular, but also invasive species, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Very different. This ecosystem is almost extinct in Palm Beach County. So we have to look for references because we don't have good references in Delray, right? Where do we go for references? And so we look at many different reference sites to try and get an idea of what it should look like if we want to do restoration of this particular ecosystem. We also have hardwood hammocks. They're both on the barrier island and also in the interior. So these are like islands of hardwood vegetation. Many different species of trees in the canopy and the subcanopy, they exist as islands. This is actually a mistake. It works in terms of understanding the structure of hardwood hammock, but hardwood hammocks, maritime hammocks, would have been, this is the intercoastal side, would have been a narrow band along the intracoastal, all right? Because the coastal strand would, as we just saw, would have taken up most of this habitat. 80 to 90% of the barrier island would have been coastal strand. The hammock would have been this narrow band along the intracoastal, and we need to keep in mind that the intracoastal was a freshwater system, not a saltwater system. As we move into the interior, we have pine flatwoods. So these are pine communities, again, open and grassy with some saw palmettos. Scrub and scrubby flatwoods, we have a few remnants, but the really high dry areas where people settled first was this. And so you have just a couple of examples left in the community. There's still some freshwater ecosystems on the mainland, but on the barrier island, these have all been pretty much wiped out, and I just want to illustrate this point. This is pretty typical. So this is in Palm Beach, where we have historical records, and so this was a freshwater lake on the island of Palm Beach. This is where it was. And this process has been repeated over and over and over. So the freshwater wetlands, which are really critical for wildlife on the barrier islands, have all been pretty much filled. So we don't know very much about them on the barrier islands, but they're critical habitat, really important for animals and plants as well. And so we have some idea what they were like, but the information is much less than we have for others. So we can use created wetlands as references. So people are building freshwater wetlands in places like Pan's Garden, and there's even retention areas in Ocean Ridge that we can look at and see, well, what's successful, what works there, what likes that, what thrives, and so forth. To give us an idea that if we were going to do freshwater wetland restoration on the barrier island, what that might look like. All right, in terms of modern settlement of South Florida, we know that people were really absent for a long period of time, from the 1770s, right, until around 1900 or so, when population started to move in. So we know that just historically that Palm Beach County was part of Dade County, and so forth, and people started moving in really around the beginning of the 1900s. What's important is this strip of land right here, this Atlantic coastal ridge. This is where people settled. This is the upland area. And so when we talk about conservation, what we've conserved and what we haven't, this is really important because most of the biodiversity of southeastern Florida was found on the barrier islands or in that elevated Atlantic coastal strip. Long ago, people recognized that we were losing critical and important biodiversity. John Kuckle Small, a very important botanist, famous person from New York Botanical Garden, speaking out long ago about the loss of biodiversity in South Florida. By the mid-20th century, the transformation of the barrier islands was pretty much complete build out on the barrier islands. And this happens to be Palm Beach. This is Delray Beach. So that hardening of the landscape, the building of seawalls and other structures, not only were bad for the environment, they were bad for people. They did not work at all. And this is an example of that. And so we can see this illustration of where are the people, where are the conservation areas, right? So South Florida has one of the highest concentrations of protected areas anywhere in the country, in very high proportion for most of the world. But most of those conservation areas are in the wetlands, in the interior, which are important. Let's not make any mistake about what I'm saying. But what we're missing is are the protected areas where those uplands were, right? So this is the Florida Natural Areas Inventory conservation map for Florida, and it's zoomed in to Delray Beach, Boynton, North Boca, and those orange patches. So the one on the left, this is going to be the eastern edge of the Everglades, right? So that's going to be federal, and those orange patches are local, municipal, and so what we really have that's on their map is the Weeks Scrub Preserve, and this is Murakami. This is County, Delray Oaks. This is Boca, Boynton, and this is Green Cay wetland, which is a created wetland. So what's important, and the city might want to think about long term, is actually getting official designations of things like the Municipal Beach and Atlantic Dunes, Barwick, and some of these other places as conservation areas, because right now they're not designated as such, and so it diminishes the importance of those areas in the minds of the people that are looking at the data. So that's something that could happen fairly quickly. Why does this matter? So it matters because southeastern United States is a global biodiversity hotspot. What does that mean? That means that we have a high number of species, especially endemic species found nowhere else in the world, but it's also under extreme threat, right? And so there's lots and lots of species that are dependent upon what we do in the built environment because of the way the conservation system is set up and where people settled. So fragmentation, the build out of where we all live and work, and the lack of conservation areas in the uplands leads to loss of species. And so what we know is that some species, like this Florida leaf-winged butterfly, are very, very sensitive to disturbance and degradation. So that butterfly that used to be in Monroe County, southern Miami-Dade County, is now only in Everglades National Park. All of the parcels outside of the park are too small to support that species. And this beach cluster vine, one that is still in Delray, mostly through restoration efforts, is also very sensitive, whereas other species like the hummingbird and so forth are more adaptable. So when we're talking about restoration, we're talking about transforming the way people think about this problem. If we think about business as usual, it's about reducing impact or gray infrastructure, raising roads and this kind of business. And we have to actually transform our thinking. We have to be making change with green infrastructure. We have to be using plants. So our thinking is about neutrality and restorative activities. So we know we must restore degraded ecosystems, small and large, fragmented and connected. Every bit matters. Native plants provide all kinds of benefits in terms of aesthetics, diversity, and so forth. And we know that there were hundreds of species. There's still no census of all the native species that were in Delray and what's been lost. That would be an interesting thing for us to do. We've done it in other places. We just haven't done it in Delray. And that plants are the basis for animal diversity and vice versa. So, plants need pollinators, animals need things to eat at the base trophic levels and so forth. Every site where we can do restoration matters, and there's a whole bunch of benefits and things that we can do and what they will help with. So increasing numbers of species and population sizes, increasing connectivity, improving ecosystem functions such as pollination, reducing population of invasive species, reducing pesticides and fertilizers, and reducing emissions and sequestering carbon and carbon equivalents. What are the impacts at the landscape scale? So this is an example from Miami-Dade County. So these are conservation areas, the green in the south for pine rocklands, a globally imperiled ecosystem. And this is a program by Fairchild, Connect to Protect. And all those pink dots are Connect to Protect yards, neighbors, schools, et cetera. This is the bird diversity that's recorded as a consequence of that activity. So there's data that shows that the cumulative effect of individual activities at the yard level or at the school level, et cetera, have a big impact. All right, so we're gonna take a look now of what's going on in Delray. And so the first thing that we want to recognize is that restoration really started in Delray with the removal of those hard structures, okay, along the Atlantic Ocean, what's now the municipal beach. But that was kind of that was the gray infrastructure part of the problem. So in terms of the vegetation, the actual ecosystem components, that was really going by the 1980s. And there were some things that happened early, like putting in what's now an invasive scaevola and other things that were not the right direction, but ultimately the things started moving in the right direction. So restoration has actually been going on in the city for quite a while, but people maybe didn't recognize it for what it was or didn't value it as highly as we might value it now. So in the 80s and 90s, we actually have very, projects that were going on, biodiversity restoration that's very closely related to standards-based restoration now. So you can see this is an attempt to restore a coastal strand type ecosystem. It's not perfect. The salt palmettos are too far to the west, for example, and there's too many of them, and there's way too many sea grapes up here that you can see. But it generally was moving in the direction of restoring coastal strand, right? There was also work done on rare species. So rare species work is part of habitat restoration. This is classic habitat restoration. You're trying to restore the habitat for a rare species. And so this is work that was done by Fairchild and collaborators in the city. And so this was the outplanting of this beach cluster vine, this federally endangered herb that lives on the coast. And that work has continued through present day with work that IRC has done in collaboration with the city and others. But not all is good. There are still challenges, and we need to recognize that. So there was beach cluster vine in the interior of Atlantic Dunes Park. All of those plants have been lost. That population has been wiped out. And it's been wiped out through primarily the invasion of Brazilian pepper into that park, and it's just overwhelming shading out and losing that population. This is what that area looked like last year. So this is a mass of dead this is classic Brazilian pepper kind of understory, what it looks like. And so if we don't take continuous action, right? So one of the things that we need to make really clear to decision makers and land managers is we can't throw a bunch of money into restoration today and walk away for 10 years. If you do that, you're not using your money wisely, because this is what's going to happen, right? So Fairchild was there, and then nothing was done for a long time, and that work was lost. And those species, that subpopulation was lost as well. All right, so IRC has been working at Atlantic Dunes Park and with logistical support from the city and financial support from a whole bunch of different institutions since 2016 to try and recover some of the biodiversity for that particular park. And the challenge is that this is a path, this is the same path. So this is a path from 1991 after a freeze. Right, so we have, this is what Atlantic Dunes Park, Vinny's been there, yeah, many times. You know this spot, I'm sure, right? So this is completely different now. So that patch of salt palmettos are these dead stems here. Okay, so that whole area was overwhelmed by Brazilian pepper and sea grape, and all the biodiversity that was in that system was lost. So we're trying to get in there and do as much coastal strand restoration that we can. And we had a pretty big project, funding from Impact 100, New York Life, and then a continuation of the project with Community Foundation of Palm Beach and Martin counties. And now we have some funding from the city of Delray Beach to continue that work. Also challenging our invasive species, and this is also true on the municipal beach. There's work, it's intermittent, it needs to be continuous. It needs to be every year, there needs to be a budget item to do invasive species control on the municipal beach, at Atlantic Dunes Park, and in fact in all of the conservation or potential conservation areas in the city. Again, it's not the kind of thing where you can go in once and then come back in 5 years. Not a good use of funding because if you keep at it, your costs go down, down, down. If you do it and walk away, your costs are just gonna zoom back up. Sea grapes, highly contentious issue in the city of Delray Beach, but the ecology is really quite simple. All right, sea grapes are a monotypic species that shade out everything underneath them and have a negative effect on biodiversity and ecosystem integrity and resilience. So one of the things we try to do is talk to people about the science and about the conservation implications of sea grapes and what does it mean to trim them and so on and so forth. And so we try to get the information out there so that people can help come to better conclusions. And oops, let me go back. Let me go back again. And so this is Atlantic Dunes Park where we've taken out Brazilian pepper, for example. And here's the sea grape structure here. But we've been able to do a bit of coastal strand restoration, but we could do more if we could reduce the sea grape further at that particular location. We've done dozens of species restoration, all kinds of different species in the system. Just again, I could give you an example of what biodiversity restoration looks like, or habitat restoration. And then we're working on getting a coastal restoration center, helping to design that with the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach at Phipps Ocean Park in the town of Palm Beach, and all the different attributes of the Restoring the Gold Coast program. All right, so moving off of the coast, we did work at the Lake Ida parcel, which is just north of the canal, north of the dog park there at Lake Ida, with support by the Community Foundation. That work went for a couple of years, and we haven't had support to continue, but work needs to continue at that location, although I will admit it's highly complex, both ecologically and logistically. Some things that we're just starting, all right, with Kent's support of the city, Orchard View. So this is a hardwood forest. This actually was a drainage way historically, but we have problems with air potato and syngonium and other plants, and so we've been working in there for about a year. But it's just, I guess the point I want to make to people, if you go there, tell us what you think, but keep in mind it's just getting going. Restoration takes long time frames, all right? So we're getting there, and our first and major goal was to get the vines out of the canopy, right? So we lost some big oak trees there from vines, and so we want to protect the canopy because that's the most important structural element of that particular ecosystem. And so now we've got the vines mostly out of the canopy, and they're now into the subcanopy or shrub layer, and that's going to take another bit of work. The reference for that again is this hardwood hammock, so a multi-species, diverse canopy, and with an island-like structure. Yeah. We're also working at Barwick there, just kind of initiating invasive species control, getting the vines out of the pine trees, just starting the process of opening things up a little bit. But this is the reference, right? So a long way to go, right, in terms of getting something that even looks remotely like this. But again, most of the biodiversity at Barwick Park has been lost. So that's all the grasses and the wildflowers and all that kind of stuff. Some of it will come back during restoration, but it will take time. What's important is that we're working on some techniques that we've developed in Miami-Dade County doing direct seeding. So this is a direct seeding plot we put in a few months ago with Delray Beach staff, park staff. And then this is native grasses already coming up. We just do little strips, they're little 2 or 3 foot long strips that we can put in grass seed, and those clumps then begin to spread. It's a highly effective, very inexpensive method that we can deploy. Places that we've been looking at that we have not started work, but we're starting to have conversations. For example, Bexley Park. And what I want to point out there, this is going to be a complicated site. We have hardwoods, we have flatwoods, but one of the things we do is we look for the evidence. And so at Barwick even, we have a pine tree. We have pine flatwoods vegetation, the understory still remnant there. So we may not be able to do pine flatwoods restoration throughout, but we should at least aspire to do some flatwoods restoration. Leon Weeks, this is the current condition. This is a reference site. So you can see that it's just overgrown. There's very little light on the ground, and so there's a lot of work that's needed there. We've been collaborating with the city now for a while, about a year actually, in terms of an official agreement, and we've been working with training, park staff, and talking about restoration methods and protocols and so forth. And we look forward to continuing that work under Kent's leadership in the next year. All right, just super fast, what can you folks do? I just want to point out natives to your neighborhood. So this is a tool that you can use to get lists of native plants that might be appropriate for your particular location based on historical and native ranges. And so you just go to our website and click on online resources and choose natives to your neighborhood and put in your zip code. This is my zip code, and you'll get lists of plants, and I'm just going to skip the list and go to tell you what there's information on trees and shrubs. This happens to be two common species, but there are also species that you probably have never heard of and haven't used. Vines. The website will connect the vines and all the different kinds of plants to the wildlife that utilize them. Ground covers, again, showing you the relationship between these. So moving beyond kind of like the basic pollinator garden kind of idea, but actually habitat restoration in the sense that we're talking about it here, where you're using your garden to actually create habitat for native species, both plant and animal. And then there's all kinds of information, a growing amount of information on the animals that could utilize your landscape if you were to plant those native species. Just in closing, it's really important. It's a serious topic, right? No joke, but we have to have the right attitude about it, right? Everything we got to do, take one step at a time, one day at a time. We got to wake up and feel good about ourselves. So I always encourage people to be creative and to have fun while they're doing it. All right. And then it takes time. It takes time to do. It takes time to build support. But we have to be in this for the long haul.